Hey, welcome back everybody. Today we're going to be focusing on this common problem I've heard my students say many times before: my vocabulary is bad. So if you've ever said this or thought this is the lesson for you. So welcome back. My name is Sharon. I'm so very glad that you're here for this short lesson about vocabulary. So let's get right to it. So the reason that vocabulary is so important to talk about and how to build it is it's key to our ability to communicate. We can't communicate well if we cannot access the vocabulary that we need. We can't speak fluently, we can't write fluently, and when we can't do those things, it's very hard for us to be confident in our speaking abilities. And so this is really the reason that I start with vocabulary, because vocabulary is that that foundation that we need to have really strong English language skills. Okay. So to understand how to improve your vocabulary, let's talk just a little bit about research into the brain. So obviously, you can't remember everything, and there's a very important evolutionary reason for that. Let's just talk about the brain in general right now. So here's a model of the brain. We'll give it a spin. So everything that you see in the lower part of the brain is very instinctual. It's been around a lot longer in human evolution. And the top part of the brain, all of this area that you see up here at the top, that is much more recently developed. So that helps you think about what I'm going to tell you now about how we process information and memory. So let me make myself go away. So let's talk about parts of the brain. So the very bottom of the brain, we have the brain stem. And this part of the brain is responsible for heartbeat, our blood pressure, our survival. So when you're thinking about what's necessary to survive, those parts of our survival come from the brain stem. That part of the brain is making sure that we continue to do those things and continue to live. Next part, that's down here at the bottom of the brain, is called the cerebellum. And cerebellum, it has a lot of functions. It's involved in balance, but also procedural memory. So for example, how to drive a car, how to tie your shoes, how to put on your clothes, all those things that we do without thinking about. They're just part of procedures that we do. That's procedural memory. So once we've learned how to do those things, they become kind of instinct to us. So cerebellum is responsible for that. Then we have the amygdala, and this is where our emotional memories are made. So think about the very best times in your life and the very worst times in your life. Those memories are made and processed with the emotional processing of those memories makes them become deeply seated in our brains and very, very hard to forget. And the amygdala is involved in that. So moving on, the top part of the brain, we have the cerebral cortex. And this is where our short-term and our long-term memories are processed, events that we experience and facts that we learn. And finally, we have hippocampus, which is responsible for long-term memory. Now, a lot of these things, especially with the cerebral cortex and the hippocampus, researchers are still finding out their exact roles that they play. But I think in general, it helps to remember that the things that we need to do instinctually are often processed down here at the bottom of the brain, and the things that we have to think about are processed up here at the top. And so this all becomes important when we talk about how do we remember vocabulary? What are the tricks and tips to making your vocabulary learning long-lasting? So there are 3 types of memory that cognitive psychologists classify. We start with sensory memory. We have working memory and long-term memory. So the way that this happens in the human experience is when we're in the moment, we are sensing a lot of things. We are using our eyes, we're using our ears, we are smelling things. All of the senses around us are taking in information, and we cannot hold onto all of that information. Our brain has to figure out what to let go. And so that's where sensory memory comes in. We don't hold on to all this information, but what we do hold on to goes into working memory. And then from there, whatever we whatever we manage to move into the next stage moves into long-term memory. And we'll talk about how to do that in a moment. So you might be wondering, how long are these stages? Well, sensory memory is less than a second. So when you think about that, it's so very fast. So it's literally just taking in information and quickly deciding what to get rid of and what to hold on to into the next moment. And then we have working memory, which is longer, but not much longer. It's really only 10 to 15 seconds. And the general rule of thumb that cognitive psychologists say is that we're usually able to hold on to about 7 plus or minus 1 item at a time. So what I mean is, if I gave you 7 numbers, you could probably remember 6, 7, or 8 of those numbers. If I gave you 10 numbers, you could probably still only remember 6, 7, or 8 of those numbers. If I gave you 12, again. So our working memory is usually only able to hold 7 plus or minus 1 item within the 10 to 15 seconds. And then from there, if we manage to hold on to information and move it into long-term memory basically is anything longer than 15 seconds. It could be the day, it could be the week, it could be a month, or your whole lifetime is long-term memory. So what does this mean for vocabulary learning? Well, we can't possibly make every memory that you have super emotional. What I always say to my students when they're learning vocabulary is that the things that we remember are things that are highly emotional or unusual, and it's really hard to make every single word that you learn highly emotional or highly unusual. And so what we have to do is we have to train our brain, and we have to repeat. So if you think about when you're learning a word, you're creating a neural pathway to that information. And the more that you review that information, the deeper you're making that pathway in your brain. You're making it stronger and stronger and stronger, so it's easier and easier and easier for you to access that information. So that is the reason your whole life your teachers have said, review, because it absolutely works. So my rule of thumb when you're repeating, rehearsing, and practicing is that you have to follow the rule of 8 times. You need to read it 8 times, write it 8 times, hear it 8 times, and say it 8 times. And the reason that you need to do it in those different ways is that you're encountering that word with multiple senses. So the more you can see it and hear it and speak it and write it with your hand, you are making all these hooks onto the information so it stays in your brain. So the more you repeat it, the more ways that you repeat it, the stronger you're making those neural pathways, and the more hooks you're making on the information so that it stays in your brain. And of course, it is extremely important that you periodically review this information. If your plan is to learn words every week, you learn the words for the week, but then you also go back to the previous week's words and review those words. So you have to have constant review until, basically until you feel that I've mastered that word, there's no way I could forget that word. So if you're an intermediate English language learner and I show you this pen and I ask you what color is it, you would immediately say black. You wouldn't have to think about it because that word is so deeply embedded in your brain. You've practiced it so many times. All right. So for your vocabulary learning system, you have to do something. Often, in the past 10 plus years, as I've been teaching students, I'll ask my students what they do to learn vocabulary. And often, their answer is something like this. Hope? Hope is not a strategy. You cannot just hope that your vocabulary will grow. It doesn't happen like that. Some students think, well, I'll just experience the language and just pick it up as I go along. You could be that person that can do that, but that's really not that many language learners. A lot of language learners really need to put in time and effort to studying vocabulary. So my overall recommendation is you can't do those things. You have to study. You have to do something. You have to be intentional about your vocabulary study. Some students want to know, well, should I do a handwritten vocabulary study or should I do digital? And I have in my references a website where you can go and see some more information about this. But in general, it's better to handwrite so that you're encountering that word in multiple ways. So you don't just see it digitally, but you're using your hand to write down. So there you're encountering the word in two different ways. So there is pretty good evidence that you really need to do handwriting as well as the digital. So if you have an app on your phone, that's awesome, but do something else so that you're encountering that word more than just looking at it and swiping right or left. Okay. So some of my favorite vocabulary learning apps, I love Quizlet. It's still free right now in 2019. You can create cards, but you can also search for cards. So if you don't want to make your own, you can go search for what other people have made. If you speak Chinese, I've seen tons of Chinese Quizlet cards out there for learning English. Allows you to practice and play games. So Quizlet's always my first one that I recommend to students. There's also Duolingo and Memrise, which I have to say are really great for beginners. It's kind of similar to Rosetta Stone, but a little more adaptive, a little more interactive. So maybe try that if you're a beginner. So my recommendations on how many words you can learn. So let's say you're an intermediate language learner, so you've been learning English for maybe 10, 12 years, and you feel like your vocabulary is still pretty bad. Stuart Webb and Paul Nation, in their analysis of the literature, their recommendation is it's totally possible to learn 500 words in a year. So when you break that down into weeks, that's about 10 new words per week. That's totally doable. But remember that as you're learning these words, you really need to periodically review all those cards at least one time per week. So If you're learning 10 words a week, learn those 10 words, and the next week learn 10 new, but then also review the words from the previous week and the week before and the week before that. So here are my references. So if you want to go and read a little bit more about types of memory, or whether you should handwrite your vocabulary cards or do digital, or how vocabulary is learned, you can find all those references here. And I'll take this time just to say thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next time.